If you're a Ford person, you know that Ford built its first V8 back in 1932, the classic flathead, right? Turns out that's wrong, and this car right here proves it. Hi there, Rick DeBrule here with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars here in Phoenix. Tell all kinds of great stories about the automotive evolution and what was happening from decade to decade. And this car right here, this 1925 Lincoln Model L, is an interesting chapter. We'll talk more about this car in just a moment. But first, make sure you like and subscribe down below. And of course, in the comments, make sure you tell me what I got right and most importantly, what I got wrong, because even with all the research I do, there's always something that I don't get quite right when we're doing these videos. Now, let's talk very briefly about that Ford V8 engine, because of course we know Ford came out with their flathead classic engine in 1932, but that wasn't the first one they were building. It was the V8 that went into this Lincoln right here. The difference is Henry Ford and his company didn't design the engine that went into this. This was designed by Henry Leland. We'll talk more about him in just a moment. And Ford, when they acquired Lincoln, well, they started building the V8 because it was their V8 at that point in time. But unlike the Ford V8 that they built in 1932, which their company designed from the ground up, they were just the builders for this one. Before we get more into that engine, I want to talk about the history of Lincoln. The Lincoln Motor Company started with Henry Leland. It's a perfect example of how many of the early automobile manufacturers were actually very interconnected. You see, Henry Leland made a name for himself by helping to establish another company, Cadillac, which he then sold to General Motors in 1909. Now, after leaving General Motors in 1917 because of a dispute with the company leadership, during World War I, Leland started a new company. And of course, he decided to name it after one of his heroes, Abraham Lincoln. The new company's original goal was not to build cars. Instead, it was formed to manufacture Liberty aircraft engines for the U.S. military effort in World War I. Now, when the war ended, well, Leland decided to shift his sights to cars, releasing his first automobile in 1920. It was called the Model L, and like the Cadillac, it was aimed squarely at the luxury market. You know, he wanted to compete with brands like Rolls-Royce, Packard, and Pierce Arrow. Although the Model L was well engineered, the company actually struggled financially. Production costs were high. The post-war recession made it harder to sell luxury automobiles. Plus, people felt some of those early Lincolns just weren't very stylish. The result is that in 1922, the Lincoln Motor Company was put into receivership, which allowed another gentleman whose name was Henry Ford to purchase Lincoln for $8 million. Ford had dominated the mass market with the Model T, but really wanted a foothold in the luxury car segment. By 1925, Lincoln was no longer just a company founded by a former Cadillac executive. It had become the luxury division of the Ford Motor Company, with new direction and new leadership in Edsel Ford and new style that would guide its development for decades to come. Now, in 1925, you could get the Model L in a sedan, a phaeton, a limousine, a coupe, just about anything you wanted or you could imagine. And that's because back then, in addition to the Lincoln bodies, you could also just buy a chassis from Lincoln and then have it sent off to a coach builder for a particular body that they were going to build for you. In fact, that was a big part of the Lincoln business. In 1925, of the 8,000 Lincolns that were sold, I think only about 1,000 or so had Lincoln bodies. The rest, well, those were built by various coach builders. Common names in the Lincoln coach building world included LeBaron, Judkins, and Brunn, each bringing its own visual identity to the Model L. Now, in 1925, Lincoln continued to position the Model L as a car for buyers who really wanted craftsmanship and the ability to tailor a vehicle to their specific taste. And while the platform remained largely consistent, the wide range of bodywork available made each Model L slightly different. So let's take a closer look and walk around with the styling of our 1925 Lincoln Model L. And the first thing we'll notice is this big, bold Lincoln badge that's on the front, but you'll notice that very subtly, just above it, it has script writing that says Ford, and down below it, it says Detroit. On the museum car that we have here, we happen to have a couple of American flags mounted on the front. And there's good reason for this, because in the 1920s, President Calvin Coolidge decided that he was going to start using a Lincoln Model L as his official presidential limousine. And in fact, Lincolns were used for presidential limousines, I think all the way up and through the 1970s. It all started with a Model L, very similar to this one, that Calvin Coolidge decided he wanted to use for his presidential limousine. By the way, you'll notice something interesting up front. That hood ornament is very functional. This is what's called a motometer. We'll swing around to the back side, and the purpose of this is, see that little tube in there? That's so the driver can see the temperature of the water if it's getting too high. So that little motor meter allowed the driver to know if there was a overheating problem in his engine, so he could see it coming up. Perhaps not as attractive as some of the more beautiful hood ornaments, but very, very functional. Now, the car we have here at the museum is not a Lincoln-bodied car. This is, I believe, a Murray-bodied car. There is a small tag on the firewall that shows that there is a Murray tag associated with this. Murray, of course, one of the coach builders that was building cars. The styling on this is interesting because I love the way the fenders flow down right here. But you'll notice in just a few years that flowing line was going to increase anymore. And this is actually a pretty upright line, once again for 1925, but in just a few years, the flowing line would be even more dramatic, and then of course eventually it would just disappear completely. As you look across, you can see the nice accent. This is very likely the way it would have been painted in its day, with a two-tone style with one color here, this second color right here for the accent and the roof, and then of course a little pinstripe that's been added to it as well. You can see we have the artillery style wheels, the wooden wheels. In the back, what we don't have here is a trunk. We have two tires that have been put on instead. We'll go over to this LaSalle that we have right beside it. There's a reason they used to call it a trunk, because it was literally a trunk on the back of the car. No trunk, perhaps not designed for cruising cross country. More importantly, whoever was going to be sitting in the back of here, they did not want to have to spend any extra time worrying about, having a flat tires that have not one, but two tires available. Was pretty significant. Cars in 1925 would have come with a tail light right here. In fact, this one has a Lincoln stamp on it right there. These cars actually cruised pretty nicely. They were large, they were big, they were comfortable. I think this was like a 137, 138 inches long in terms of wheelbase. So it was nice and comfortable. Little cowl lights right there, kind of interesting. I'm not sure if they were supposed to be in the 1925, but they're definitely on this one. But once again, it's long, it's beautiful. They actually, in later years, actually stretched out the wheelbase. But one of the nice things is this Model L had a slightly longer wheelbase than the original Lincoln that they first came out with. And up front, by the way, I believe this grille should be nickel plated, very similar to what this is right here. Looks like somebody simply painted it aluminum as part of their restoration. And once again, for the museum car, it's fine, it looks good, but if somebody was concerned about what it looked like, they wanted to take it back to its original look, that could be very easily done. Big, beautiful 1925 Lincoln Model L. All right, let's take a closer look at the V8 engine that we have in our 1925 Model L Lincoln. And it's a pretty complicated motor, and I'll explain as we go along. To start with, it's 358 cubic inches. It's got about a 60-degree angle to the banks of cylinders coming off the two sides, and it produces about 90 horsepower. Not a lot today, but you got to remember this was 1925. That was fairly substantial for its day. The beauty of this engine is it's a nice, smooth running engine, delivering enough power, enough torque to get this fairly heavy car moving. Once again, it's not about the speed you were going, it's about getting up to speed that really mattered. This cylinder bank right here, the cylinder head is actually cast iron, and it's mounted onto an aluminum crankcase down below. You see the four spark plugs for the four pistons. They use what they call a fork and blade system for the connecting rods that would go down and connect onto the crankshaft. Where on one side, they actually have kind of like a fork, and on the other side, they have a blade, so they were actually able to connect up like that to connect to the crankshaft. It was efficient for its day, and it actually did a great job of distributing the pressure that was on that crankshaft. One of the complicated things about this engine is the fact that it uses an updraft carburetor. Now, we're used to downdraft carburetors, right? Where the air comes in, goes down through an air cleaner, for example, goes into the carburetor, then goes down into the manifold. This works differently. The air would come in through this thing right here, which has a centrifugal fan, and that would take any particles, dust, dirt, whatever, spin it around and spit it to the outside, where it would then come out the bottom, this little ridge down below. Now, after that, it would go down, go up through the carburetor, which is down in there, mix with the fuel, and then come up to this manifold and then get distributed to the cylinder banks right here. Now, the complication with this is that we have both of the exhaust manifolds on the inside of the engine right here on either side of that carburetor. So you can imagine if you were working on the carburetor, you just got out of the car, imagine how hot it was working around those exhaust manifolds. So that was one of those complications they decided they didn't want to do when they got to the model, well, the Ford from 1932 and built that flathead engine. Down below, you see we've got a Delco starter generator. That is exactly coming off of the front of the engine, the pulley that would start that up and give enough performance to get that moving so the generator is producing enough electricity. And I love the fact that we have this tiny little oil can right here. I know you had to oil the distributor, not sure what else they might have used for, but having a little oil can was just handy. Now, let's go back to that Ford engine that they created, the V8 engine for 1932. One of the things that they learned from this engine was this is way too complex. They knew they needed to create something much simpler. So while they took some of the lessons they learned here, they really took them and realized we need to do something different for that 1932 Ford V8. Now, before we actually get inside and sit down in this Lincoln Model L, there's something cool I have to show you that was available on the 1925 Lincoln. That's this right here. Look at this. It's a tilt-away steering wheel. There's a little button right here. You push this. The steering wheel can then move down, giving you more room as you get into the car, so you can slide right in. Now, the problem is, once you're in, when you're pulling this up, it's really banging against your knees. So you have your choice. You want to have easier access this way, maybe you're a little bit bigger, or do you want to simply move your knees apart? But whatever it was, you were then able to have the steering wheel come up as a classic tilt-away steering wheel. Imagine that, 1925, very forward thinking in what they were doing. Up front, it's interesting, you know, especially, and this is pretty common for this era of car, there really isn't a lot of room from side to side. Now, as you can see, we have plenty of room in the back. I mean, that's really what this car was all about. But there's not a lot of room from side to side. Now, that's possibly because A, you know, their driver was going to be driving you around, but B, they just didn't think they needed that much room. Interesting, on the steering wheel right here, you actually have a way to adjust the spark as you're driving. So once you get the car started, you know, there's a retard position, there's a driving range. So once you start the car, then you would probably move that up into the driving range so that you could actually have a smoother drive while you were going along. Down below, we've now switched into the concept of the 3 pedals. And you know, in the early years, there were all kinds of different pedal configurations. You know, the accelerator wasn't where you thought it was going to be. In fact, oftentimes it was up here on the steering wheel. By now, we've gone to 3 pedals where you have a clutch on the left-hand side, a brake on the right-hand side. And then we actually have 3 pedals, or what appears to be 3 pedals. We have one that is used for the accelerator, the other which is simply a resting point for your foot if you want to set it on there. And then the one way up here, well, this is used for the starter. So that's how you would engage the starter when you were getting to drive along. On the dash, you can see we've got a switch for lights, we've got a switch to turn on the ignition, and I believe this is for the dash lights right here. Not a lot of gauges. Over here is where we have the speedometer. You see this big beautiful clock, and then this, call it a barrel type speedometer. That's what would show you your speed, and apparently it wasn't too critical because it was over there, and frankly, it was kind of hard to see. Interesting, we have a little bit of a padded dash, a little style element. You also have the ability to open the windows so you can get a little bit of air, because remember, this is in the pre-air conditioning era, so at least you could get some nice airflow that was coming into here. This particular car has some much more modern carpeting in it. I'm assuming that the upholstery's long since been redone. But when you look in the back, you can see just how much room is back here. In fact, this has jump seats. I believe that's another indication that it was not a actual Lincoln body that was put into it. But there was plenty of room for whoever was paying the bills to be able to sit in the back, maybe have a couple of the kids sit in the jump seat. So it was big, it was comfortable, it was roomy, and the beautiful thing about this car is once you got it up to speed, it was very smooth driving, very comfortable to drive. It was, after all, a luxury car. They knew the market they were going after, and they pretty much achieved it. But this is the thing I love the most, this little kind of complex looking, but a steering wheel that could actually tilt away back in 1925. Pretty creative. Throughout the 1920s, all the way through 1930, Lincoln continued to offer the Model L, which was sold primarily as a bare chassis, as I mentioned, with coach builders building the bodies. In 1931, Lincoln introduced the Model K, which replaced this Model L. The Model K featured a new V8 engine, or at least an upgraded V8 engine, and later a V12, offering a lot more power and refinement. Lincoln continued to collaborate, though, with those high-end coach builders, while gradually introducing more standardized designs into the Lincoln line. Now, during the 1930s, the company developed a reputation for producing, well, formal and custom-bodied vehicles, including state and ceremonial cars, presidential limousines. A major shift, though, came in 1939 with the introduction of the Lincoln Zephyr-based Continental, a more streamlined and modern luxury car that really helped to define the brand's identity in the 1940s. But from 1925 onward, Lincoln evolved from a struggling independent company in the early 20s into Ford's luxury division, balancing those handcrafted designs and increasing production and standardization at the same time. This period really laid the foundation for Lincoln's future role as an American luxury car manufacturer living under that Ford brand.